Amity Schlaze. Ms. Schlaze, thank you very much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate you. Thank you for having me again.
First, tell me I did not butcher your last name. It's Schlaze?
That's correct.
Okay. Your first book, as I mentioned, inspired my producer's nickname. It's called The Forgotten Man, and it was about the history of the Great Depression and the New Deal. And in that book, you talk about how the New Deal started out with a great deal of promise, a great deal of hope, but it did not realize its expectations. If anything, it arguably made things worse. It seems to me you're making a similar argument about the so-called Great Society, the program that was launched in the mid-'60s by Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, that's right. The introduction of this book, so we're talking about the period of the 1960s, very similar to now in terms of idealism. The introduction of the book said these are lovable people who loved the people they were trying to help and actually hurt those people.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good. I think that's a good summary of many of the social efforts of the 1960s.
You talk about a man named Michael Harrington, and Amy, I remember reading his book, The Other America, when I was in college. And you talk about in the first part of your book how influential he was on policymakers. Tell us about him and explain why he had so much persuasiveness over some of our political leaders.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Well, I mean, Michael Harrington was a socialist, and he thought socialism kind of might be a good idea for the United States. And he saw that social democracy was on the trip to socialism. So say we got social democracy or social democratic laws, those, were influenced by people like Harrington. Harrington, in particular, was interested in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Lyndon Johnson promised to cure C-U-R-E, poverty, not to reduce poverty, but to cure it. And Harrington saw the government was spending $1 billion, which then was a lot. Today it would be $1 trillion. And he said, that's just chump change. It's nickels and dimes. Let's spend a lot, and let's move toward socialism. That was his hope. And you don't want to overplay his influence, but he was around when we wrote the Economic Opportunity Law, which was the law we wrote in the United States after a riot to prevent further riots, in part. Generally, the impulse was social workers, social democratic efforts, community efforts funded by the federal government will reduce unhappiness in cities as part of our anti-poverty drive.
You write in your book, Amity Schlaze, quote, most Americans shared something else with Harrington, confidence. In the 1930s, the New Deal had failed to reduce unemployment. The prolonged periods of joblessness were what had made the Depression great. But the memory of the New Deal failure had faded just enough that younger people liked the sound of the term. And memories of more recent successes fueled Americans' current ambitions. Many men were veterans, end of quote. This confidence that we could reorient society, we could cure poverty, as you pointed out. This is what drove a lot of this stuff.
Oh, yes. Well, it's always, I was looking at a flip chart, a flip picture today, on the internet where they said, well, racism is a result of capitalism. We need socialism to get rid of racism. And I thought, wow, that's pretty intense, but a lot, and pretty wrong-headed, but a lot of young people believe that. The epigram of the current book, Great Society, which I hope your listeners will pick up, there's a lot of facts you may have thought about before but never seen laid out, is nothing new, it's just forgotten. And now, here we are, people are just wealthy enough, unemployment has been low just long enough that we forgot what it was like to have higher unemployment or to see companies fail or to understand that the government can't afford everything.
In fact, about that, you write this, quote, to pay for its Great Society commitments, the U.S. government in the next decade found itself forced to set taxes so high that it further suppressed the commercialization of innovation, end of quote.
That's absolutely the case. So, if you go back and look, there were a lot of cool ideas on the shelf in the 70s, but they didn't become real, many of them, until the 90s. Think of phones where you can see the other person's face and so on, or the more recent decades. And some of that was because companies didn't have the resources to make them commercial. So we delayed a lot of innovations that we enjoy very much. Essentially, the Great Society, everyone won the Great Society in the 60s. The question was, do we get it which way? Through the government or through the private sector? Well, as a people, we chose the government. And the private sector, well, is just there to pay for that. Just as today you hear the private sector is going to pay for everything we now undertake. The private sector had some struggles. We had terrible unemployment in the 70s. We also had inflation. We had high interest rates after that. What does a high interest rate mean? And younger people don't know that today. It means the house you buy has 2 fewer bedrooms. You have 1 bedroom or 2 instead of 3 or 4. Because the interest rate is so high, that is all your purchase can bring to you. It means you can't borrow money if you're going to start a business. You might have to pay 15%, 20% for a regular business loan, not a credit card loan. A credit card might be over 20, well over 20, always. So that was the penalty that we paid, and it was terrible for all people in the 70s for the outlays of the 60s.
The book is called The Great Society, A New History. The author is my guest, Amity Shlaes. Ms. Shlaes, please don't go away. When we come back, I want to talk to you about the part of your book where you talk about black unemployment and about how the gap between black and white unemployment widened because of the Great Society. I'm Larry Elder.